Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to need to blow out that back wall for our next program. My name is Vince Stango. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at the National Constitution Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our third Town Hall program of 2014. And today we're going to ask and answer all of your questions about American politics, everything you need to know. A few items to note before we get started. First, I'd like to thank all of our members and our 1787 Society members who are here today. Your contributions and support year in and year out are what makes programs like these possible. So we thank you. We appreciate your support. We hope you enjoyed today's program. And for those who aren't members or involved in that way and have an interest, we have our membership desk down in the main lobby. You can certainly go down after the program and inquire more about becoming a member of the Constitution Center. So thank you. If you have any questions throughout the program today, please jot down your question on the note cards that you received when you checked in, and hand your card into the staff who are here today, and will be walking around taking your cards. If anyone has a cell phone or portable electronic device, they might want to silence now before we get started. Nobody wants to be that person. Okay. So it's my honor to welcome our esteemed guests today: Linda Greenhouse, Donald Ritchie, Richard Valelly, and Roger Smith. Linda Greenhouse, the winner of the 1998 Pulitzer Prize, writes for the New York Times about the Supreme Court and the law. She reported on the Supreme Court for the New York Times from 1978 to 2008. She teaches at Yale Law School and is the author most recently of the book, The U.S. Supreme Court, A Very Short Introduction. Donald Ritchie is historian of the U.S. Senate. He is tasked not only with collecting information on today's legislative events, but also with making information about the Senate's long and colorful history available to lawmakers, journalists, and to the public. Ritchie has published several books, including most recently, The U.S. Congress, A Very Short Introduction. Is that right? Do we have two very short introductions? Yes. We have three. Is that the point? Just kidding. Rick Valelly is Claude C. Smith 14 Professor of Political Science at Swarthmore College, where he has taught since 1993. Valelly previously taught at MIT and the College of the Holy Cross. He is the author of several books, including most recently Princeton Readings in American Politics. He is a member of the faculty editorial board of the University of Pennsylvania Press. And finally, Roger Smith is the Christopher H. Browne Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Smith centers his research on constitutional law, American political thought, and modern legal and political theory, with special interest in questions of citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. He was elected as an American Academy of Arts and Sciences Fellow in 2004. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Linda Greenhouse, Donald Ritchie, Rick Valelly, and Roger Smith.
Well, thank you, Vince, and I want to express my thanks and admiration for all you hardy citizens turning out on this beautiful but very cold day. It's a terrific turnout. I also want to add that all three of these authors have written books that are part of the Very Short Introduction series. Rick's book is American Politics, A Very Short Introduction, and I understand you have opportunities to get all these books, and they're all very much worth getting. My short introduction is to say that we, the people in America, have long revered our Constitution. Many Americans believe that the framers here in Philadelphia managed to achieve an enduring balance between creating a constitution that gave the national, state, and local government powers to pursue the great purposes of the preamble in ways that accorded with the express democratic will of the people, and at the same time, the Constitution created checks and balances, elections, representation, the separation of powers, and the structure of federalism that all worked to make sure that representatives could check any unwise and unjust impulses of the people on the one hand, and that the people and other government officials could check any official who proved corrupt, incompetent, or sought to grab power beyond constitutional boundaries. And most Americans today, after more than 200 years in which the U.S. Constitution, the first modern Constitution, is now in its fundamental aspects the longest enduring modern Constitution, most Americans continue to believe that we have the best Constitution in the world. Yet at the same time, at this moment, there is more dissatisfaction with the different political branches of the system that the Constitution created than there has been in much of our history. Congress, which was expected to be the branch closest to the people, the most powerful branch, is now the least popular, with its approval ratings sometimes matching our current temperatures, that is, approaching the single digits. This president is at his lowest popular approval ratings, and even the Supreme Court, traditionally approved, is less popular than it's been in the past. And so that raises a big question about the Constitution and American politics to discuss today, which is, are these popular concerns well-founded? Has something gone wrong with some or more parts of our constitutional system? Or are there things that a lot of us don't understand about what's going on in American government today? And so since Congress has the biggest popularity problem, I want to start with Don and say, what's your perception of how Congress is working in the constitutional scheme now? What should people understand about Congress in these regards?
Well, people often ask me about why Congress is so cumbersome and slow and frustrating. And I usually explain that the Constitution designed it to be cumbersome and slow and frustrating. And if it is cumbersome, slow, and frustrating, it's doing what the framers had in mind. If they wanted an efficient system, they would never have created the United States Senate. They would have created a parliamentary system, which most of the power was in the House of Representatives, and we would be the sort of the House of Lords where the former prime minister went to read the newspaper. But we created a system that there's constantly looking over everybody else's shoulder, that to get anything done in Congress, even when all the stars are aligned, even in the 111th Congress, when both chambers were controlled by the same party and the president was from that party, and it was an incredibly productive Congress. But as you remember, it was a really messy Congress to get anything done, because to get any piece of legislation through is a messy process. The voters then added an extra check onto it all by giving control of one house to another party, so that there's constant struggle back and forth between the two sides. But it seems to me that's what the Constitution set up. It was designed in many ways, as one political scientist years ago called it, as an invitation to struggle. And boy, are we struggling.
Well, I think that can't be denied. Some of those struggles take place on the Supreme Court. So Linda, what's your perception about what we need to understand to grasp how the Supreme Court is functioning now?
So if I could just push back a little bit, which is very presumptuous of me because I'm not the historian of the Senate, but about a year ago I found myself in Austin, Texas, and I went to the LBJ Presidential Library, which is a really interesting exhibit and many interesting things, and he was a very interesting man, obviously. But the most fascinating part of the exhibit there, I think, was a gallery, not much, about smaller than this, and on the wall was simply written the titles of all the bills that became law during LBJ's presidency. And it was a description of modern America. And things got done, So whatever the constitutional design is, and obviously Don is right, there have been moments when we've been able to transcend all those obstacles and actually get something done. It was both kind of inspiring and sobering to stand there and read that list of bills. But so forgive my digression, but and answer your question, what do people need to know about the court? So these little, very short introduction books, which we've all written, which are part of a series that now has, I think, about 300 titles, a very short introduction to basically everything you've ever wondered about. So when I was, and they're about 100 pages long, and when I was asked to write one, I said to myself, okay, if I were not somebody that spent all these years living at the Supreme Court, but just an interested, intelligent citizen, what would I most need to know about the court and, let's say, the relationship between the court and the Constitution that established it? And what really jumped out at me as I was sort of thinking about this is how little the Constitution says about the court. We're here in the Constitution Center, but other than establishing there shall be one Supreme Court, the Constitution and gives it certain jurisdiction, and by implication rules out other kinds of jurisdiction. There's really not much in the way of marching orders. So one theme of my book that I'm pretty committed to as a valid theme is that the court has really been the author of its own story within the constitutional framework. The court is the most kind of self-invented of the branches of government. And I'll just give one quick for instance, which is the office of the Chief Justice. So the Chief Justice is mentioned in the Constitution, not even in Article 3, in the judicial article, but in the Article 1, the congressional article, where it says the Chief Justice shall preside over the Senate trial in the impeachment of a president. And that's not only the only duty that's constitutionally given to the Chief Justice, it's the only time there's a mention of a Chief Justice in the Constitution. So we know only by inference that there's supposed to be such a person. We don't know how that person is supposed to be chosen. We know that the president proposes, nominates, and the Senate confirms, but all the federal courts of appeals, somebody becomes a chief judge by seniority. The senior chief judge under the age of 65, the senior judge on the court under the age of 65 becomes the chief judge. There's not a separate nomination and confirmation, but George Washington nominated John Jay, the first Chief Justice, and that kind of set off the idea that it's a separate office that has to be named separately, and even if a sitting justice, such as Justice Rehnquist, whom President Reagan elevated to the Chief Justiceship in 1986, that had to be a whole separate nomination and confirmation. So that's just our practice. It's not hardwired into our system. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Okay, so the Senate may be operating in ways, or not successfully operating in ways the framers of the Constitution anticipated. The court has developed in ways that go beyond what they provided for and may have anticipated. But what about the American political system as a whole? I want to turn to Rick here, whose book considers the whole system, but you've also written extensively on political parties over the years. And there is a perception that political parties may be at the heart of the problem now, and political parties are things that are not provided for in the Constitution. Many of the framers were opposed to the development of political parties. We soon concluded that this complicated governmental structure the government created could not be operated effectively without networks of officials that were united in national political parties. So we've had them through most of our history. But today, the perception is that the parties are polarized, and that is making it impossible for Congress to operate. It makes it impossible even to get people appointed to the judiciary, and that so maybe the parties are at the heart of our problem. Is that right, or would you?
I think that's very close to it. Political scientists have shown that public approval of how the political process is working and how the different institutions work are variable, and they go up and down with the state of the economy. Not too surprising a finding. And macroeconomic performance is a basic factor in public evaluation of our institutions. And right now our macroeconomic performance is poor. It could be better. And so if we had higher growth rates and we had tight labor markets, I think that we'd have a much higher approval ratings for institutions and for our political processes. But I think there's an extra element, which is that the disagreement between the parties is seen widely as an obstacle to getting to better macroeconomic performance. government shutdowns, disagreements over how to spend and how to tax, different ways of managing the economy. Those things divide the party so intensely now, and have over the past 2 years since that people kind of connect the dots. They go, oh, great, the economy's not working so well, and the people who could be helping the economy to work better are not coming up with the policies to do that. So even though parties are very good at bringing people in and educating them and at making the Constitution work, right now I think people see them as, and certainly people like Ben Bernanke see the disagreements between the parties as actual obstacles to better macroeconomic performance.
Rick, I think the best friend left of political parties is the Supreme Court, because whenever there's a case brought by a minority party, an outside party with, wants to get on a ballot or wants to challenge the system as it is, the court says no. And the court really seems to believe that the two major parties are what serves us best.
It seems to treat the two-party system as if it were constitutionally
Right.
enshrined, even though it's not. And we have other features of the modern political system that we often regard as constitutionally enshrined, even though they're not. And so I want to ask Don in this regard, what about the filibuster rules? My students always believe that the filibuster is in the Constitution, but it's not. Filibuster rules have changed in the past. They changed recently. Are they part of the problem, or changes part of the solution? What do you think?
The Constitution is a remarkably short document, but that puts incredible power into the smallest phrases. And there's a phrase that said each House of Congress can set its own rules and elect its own officers. And so, for instance, we have a chaplain in the Senate. People are always suing the Senate to say that that violates the First Amendment. The courts say, no, there's this provision that says they can elect their own officers. And that's the same provision that involves rules, and it's the reason why the courts will keep their hands off of any challenges to the rules of the Senate, because the Senate creates its own rules. An old parliamentarian of the Senate used to say, the rules of the Senate are perfect. And if they change every one of them, the rules of the Senate will be perfect. And what he meant was the Senate writes rules to fit what it needs. And the Senate is not a majoritarian body. The House represents, a majority of people in the House represent a majority of the population. In the Senate, the states are equal. So California, with 37 million people, has 2 senators. And Wyoming, with 500,000 people, has 2 senators. Half of the population in the United States lives in 10 states, and they have 20 senators. The other half lives in 40 states, and they have 80 senators. So we're just not a majoritarian body. So we've created, in addition to the rules that the Constitution requires the Senate to have 2/3 to overturn a veto, or to, the little business about if the House impeaches somebody by a simple majority, it takes a 2/3 vote to throw them out of office in the Senate. So we're in a very different situation. And then we've created these rules that require a supermajority, essentially, to cut off debate. Now, what that's fostered in some respects is it's put a huge amount of weight on the majority leader of the Senate to beg, borrow, and steal to get a couple of votes from the other party so they can invoke cloture. And everybody expects the majority leader of whichever party is in the majority. They've got to go out there and they've got to get those extra votes to get their 60 votes. And so in this Congress, this supposedly absolutely polarized, paralyzed Congress, the Senate passed an immigration bill, and it passed a farm bill, and it passed a highway bill by big bipartisan majorities. And the House of Representatives, which is this majority rule, the majority gets whatever it wants, hasn't been able to pass any of that legislation. And in fact, if the Speaker of the House has to ask for votes from the minority party, it's seen as a sign of weakness. So I've suggested maybe the House needs the filibuster.
So you want to add on the Senate example. I've spoken like the historian of the Senate. So I want to go from the role of Congress, though, back to the court, Linda, and note that as part of the system of checks and balances in the 1970s, when Congress was concerned about executive powers, and especially in relation to national security, but also concerned to meet national security challenges, it created the FISA court to oversee various kinds of searches, to give approval to them. Of course, it's a source of great controversy today. What a lot of us didn't realize, and I'm on a discussion list of law and court scholars a lot of scholars didn't realize how the FISA court is appointed, but the FISA court is appointed in just the way you described. The Chief Justice, the powers of that office position have expanded over time, and so the Chief Justice appoints from the federal judiciary all the members of the FISA court unilaterally. The President's Commission has just made recommendations to alter that. Do you think this is an example in which the elaboration of the Chief Justice and the court's power has been in some ways misguided, or is this part of an appropriate development?
Yeah, so I mean, the system has come in for a lot of criticism because Chief Justice Roberts has used his power to appoint, I guess there's 11 judges on the FISA court, and they're all, or maybe all but one, Republican-appointed judges whom he gave this extra duty to sit on the FISA court. I don't know. I mean, I don't actually think that's part of the problem. It's very interesting because one didn't know this, and the Chief Justice has dozens of statutory duties, including sitting on the board of the Smithsonian Institution and vetting the law books that are purchased by the Library of Congress. I mean, all kinds of crazy things. So this was one of them. But I think the structural problems with FISA and the wiretapping and everything wouldn't really be different the way that court is set up. I can't imagine that there would necessarily be a bunch of judges appointed to this very sensitive institution who would suddenly start, denying the government's wiretap request. So I think it's more a question of the optics than the reality that's had an impact there.
Okay, Rick, I want to give you a chance. I asked you about political parties, but you've written about the system as a whole. Is it optics or reality there? Is the perception that the political system as a whole is just not working as well as it should, or as it has in the past, as in the days of LBJ's legislation, or is that an unrealistic characterization?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there is gridlock, and we've had government shutdowns, and we have intense disagreements, and the Constitution, when you put the checks and balances together with polarized parties and strong differences of policy views, you can get stalemate rather than governance. And the Constitution has a Janus-faced quality to it in that respect. So the Constitution and polarization don't mix well. On the other hand, the more intense politics that we're living through now in terms of disagreements is, I think, broadly engaging and mobilizing. And I think the strengthening of the parties, in fact, has made American citizens more aware of politics and has made citizens understand what goes with what better. That is to say, they understand what are the different connections across different kinds of policy domains. They understand what's a conservative issue on a specific policy question, and they understand what a liberal issue is, a liberal stance is on a specific policy issue. So some people think that's that's too bad that we're sorting a little bit into different camps. But the upside of that, I think, is that people they get a lot more than they used to about what's going on in public affairs, and people are more engaged. Not only in terms turnout is up, but also people are more cognitively engaged than they used to be. So polarization is two-sided. It leads to disagreements that are sometimes very hard to finesse, except through these kinds of showdowns, but they also lead to a much more civic kind of polity and political system than we used to have.
That makes me want to ask for anyone about another element of American political life that has developed under the rubric of constitutional rights and powers in ways that go beyond what the framers could have anticipated, and that's the media, who are sometimes seen as a fourth branch of government, or the fourth estate at any rate. And the media obviously providing more opportunities for communication and interactive participation than ever before. Some observers think this is only contributing to polarization and gridlock, as everybody listens just to people who agree with them and in fact tend to get pushed further in the process. On the other hand, as you just indicated, there are lots more opportunities for information, for engagement, and maybe that means that the media is playing a positive role in contemporary American life. Any thoughts on the media as how it relates to the way the system is working now? Now, Linda, you've been in the media for a long time, so.
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's certainly true when we all were kids and everybody watched Walter Cronkite and, everybody was watching the same news, and this is not an original observation from me, certainly. But on the other hand, you can't now divorce media from the internet, right? So the ability on the internet to download documents in real time, speeches, court decisions, bills, transcripts, debates, and see for yourself, unmediated, what actually has occurred, I think is a fabulous development. I mean, when I started covering the Supreme Court back in the 70s, if the court issued a decision, I could not, as a reporter, engage in an informed conversation with anybody in the country who hadn't been at the court to actually get a copy of it. There was no, part of my job was getting 2 copies of everything, and one would be sent up from Washington to New York on an overnight bus. So that, this sounds like on a Conestoga wagon, so that the New York Times editorial board, in the fullness of time the next morning, could get these opinions and peruse them and come to some decision about it. So, I'm digressing a little about the media, but I think we live in a world, there's too much information. We're all drowning in information. We all, as citizens, need to develop the skills to sort out the garbage from the valuable and so on. But we can learn to do that. We can, I hope, teach our children to do that, not to believe everything they read on the internet, but to use it as an enormous tool of information. So, as I said, I think there's pluses and minuses.
From the Congress's point of view, Congress is very interested in communications because they want their constituents to know what they're doing and to remember that they're doing it for them. And that's been true from day one because the House of Representatives opened its doors to the press on the very first day of operation. The first telegraph message in the United States was sent from the Capitol building to Baltimore. What hath God wrought? The message back was, what's the news from Washington? And so right away it became any time of new type of media Congress has jumped on. Every senator is now got social media pages. A lot of them are tweeting. They're into doing anything. And it had a big impact on the last presidential election when the Democrats, at least, used the social media very effectively to get out the young vote. The youth vote actually increased between 2008 and 2012, which was a huge shock to everybody, especially to the Republicans. They hadn't counted on that in the process because that's the group of constituents who are most unpredictable about coming out. Older voters are much more predictable, but younger voters come and go when they get caught up in it. And the media is now being used to energize a lot of people into the political process.
Rick?
Well, I think the mixed bag idea about the media is exactly right, that when we had a common media experiences, we only had 3 anchors to listen to, and we had major newspapers of national record. Everything was a lot slower, yes, but also we all shared the same information experience. And now we're in information bubbles, and lots of different kinds of information bubbles, and some of them are very shrill, and people see the world in kind of odd and skewed ways. So I agree with Linda, though, that at the same time, people are able to get information much more quickly, even if they do have to develop skills for managing the information glut. And as Don says, the pressures or the incentives for politicians to experiment with communications are here, and they're going to grow and proliferate. There's also an enormous amount of pressure on politicians to figure out ways to manage their reputations online as well. And so that there are new pressures that they face in managing their communications. I think we're going through a sea change of the kind that we went through with the rise of radio and television, and it's going to take a while for politicians and for the relationship between people in office and us as citizens to settle down into a new set of linkages, and it's hard to know exactly what that will be. But we're in a major change that is as consequential as the previous changes that I mentioned, the rise of the nonpartisan newspaper and then the rise of radio and television, the broadcast media.
Just a little thing about the sea change, and you mentioned about radio and TV. One of the things when radio came along was that politicians who used to walk all across the stage orating had to stand in one place. And some of the early ones forgot so frequently they actually tied themselves to the microphone so that they wouldn't walk out of the distance of being heard in the process. So it takes a little bit to adjust to whatever kind of technology is thrown up at you.
Well, I've received some fascinating questions from all of you, and in keeping with the more interactive processes that modern media provide, but also that the Constitution created as a system of government, I want to ask some of these questions, and I've just pulled out some that are aimed at the expertise of each of the speakers. So let me begin, Linda, with you. The question is, there are partisans on both sides on the Supreme Court. Do you believe that political partisanship is adversely affecting the court's decisions to the disadvantage of the American people?
Yeah, I'm glad someone asked that. I wanted to say something about polarization on the court because, we now almost take it for granted that it's a court with 4 on one side and 4 on another side and Justice Kennedy in the middle, and we assume that, it was always that way, but that's really a kind of a modern development. I mean, early in the not too distant past, it was kind of maybe 3 on one side, 3 on one side, and 3, a Potter Stewart, a Lewis Powell, a Byron White in the middle, so that people arguing to the court had to make a kind of a broader-based argument, and they weren't just going to, what will it take to move Anthony Kennedy? So I think the perception that the court has become part of the partisan polarization is in part responsible for the fact that the court is now below 50% in the public opinion polls. It's a little hard to disaggregate that from the general sour feeling about the government. So I think the confirmation process has become quite problematic. The fact that I think Elena Kagan got only, 5 or 7 Republican votes in what, for a nomination that wasn't even going to change the kind of ideological complexion of the court. It just became a matter of political identity that Republicans were not going to vote for a Democratic nominee. It's unfortunate. I think it's troublesome for the court in the public space, and it's a troublesome development.
Well, since polarization is such a central concern, here's a question for you, Rick, although Don might want to address it too. Has the change to popular primary elections to nominate candidates for the parties exacerbated the polarization of the parties?
It turns out that it's not the primary process itself. It's the fact that if you lose the primary, you can't get, there are sore loser laws in most of the states. And actually, someone must have been reading the New York Times today to ask this question, because the New York Times op-ed page had a great piece by Mickey Edwards, but he was actually building off of research that Michael Kang and some political scientists, Michael Kang is a legal academic, have done that shows that the presence of sore loser laws, the fact that Joe Lieberman would then have to run as an independent since or Arlen Specter had to switch parties. In other words, this fact that once you're lost in a primary, even if you know that you could win a general election because you're moderate, you're stuck. That does contribute to polarization at the margin in a way that's not insignificant. It's not huge. There are lots of polarization has many sources. It's an overdetermined sea change that we've gone through, but that's one of them. One of the factors.
Can I add into that the word primary has become a verb on Capitol Hill now. We're going to primary you. Yeah. And that's to pressure people to stay in line with their party's general tenor. But interestingly, when Mary Cheney dropped out of the race in Wyoming, and when Senator Enzi stepped onto the Senate floor, they were senators high-fiving him because he had withstood a challenge, very solid conservative, had withstood a challenge from his right. And everybody there essentially was in danger of being challenged, not from the opposition to them, but in a sense, but by somebody who was even further on the political spectrum. And there's a sense that to get anything done in Congress, you've got to be willing to compromise. And these candidates who are on the far ends of the spectrum were running on the promise that they would never compromise, which would make the political system work even less efficiently than it does now.
So we have another question concerning what's often portrayed as a source of contemporary polarization, that is gerrymandering of districts to make them overwhelmingly one party or the other. The Supreme Court did many years ago in a case coming out of Connecticut hold that structuring districts in ways that accommodated the concerns of both parties was not unconstitutional, but there is the perception today that gerrymandering is exacerbating all the problems we're talking about. So we have a question: should gerrymandering be eliminated from the redistricting process, and what are the implications of that?
Every October I take a tour of congressional staff to Congressional Cemetery, which is about a mile behind the Capitol building. And we always stop at the tomb of Eldridge Gerry, who had been governor of Massachusetts when the Massachusetts state redesigned their congressional districts in such a peculiar way that a cartoonist turned it into a gerrymander with like a salamander with a figure. And he then went on to become vice president and died in office, which is the reason he's at Congressional Cemetery. But we've had gerrymandering since the very beginning of Congress. It's part of the House. We don't have it in the Senate, fortunately. We're the only body in the country that's not one person, one vote. But the House of Representatives, both parties have gerrymandered whenever their party has controlled the state legislature. And there are advantages and disadvantages of that. For one, particularly with minority districts, a lot of times they've created districts that are overwhelmingly minority solid. And that sometimes moved them out of one district to another for one party's advantage to the other. But it's created a great amount of solidity for the minority members of the House of Representatives, who get reelected almost in the same way that old Southern senators used to get reelected. And because seniority usually determines chairmanships, a number of members of the Black Caucus have become chairmen of very powerful, significant committees. And so there are advantages and disadvantages to any system. But quite now, in this last election, the Democrats charged that they actually had 1 million more votes cast for members of the House. But because of gerrymandering and the way the system worked out, the Republicans are still in the majority. So each side has a reason for supporting it and opposing it.
Yeah, I was going to mention that when you talked about the House as a majoritarian institution. Those numbers suggest that it's something other than that. I mean, the creation of the minority-majority districts is a real double-edged sword, because that's what led to the rise of the Republicans from the southern, in the South, because of the packing of African-American voters into inner-city districts and creating these white suburban rings that then turned to the Republican parties. It's a complicated picture. There's a wonderful real-time experiment going on in California, right, that has set up a nonpartisan redistricting commission. And it'll be really interesting to see. Of course, California is such a democratic state by and large, but just to see how that works when you take the redistricting process out of the hands of the politicians. It'd be very interesting.
Some of the states are turning it over to the judiciary, so they're
It's another
looking
double-edged sword.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Rick, there's a debate amongst political scientists about how important gerrymandering really is. Would you like to speak to the gerrymandering issue?
Well, the debate boils down to people saying, how can gerrymandering be causing polarization? If the Senate is polarized as much as the House has, but the Senate's not gerrymandered, then something else is going on to cause polarization among members of the House. And that's one of those kinds of things that political scientists like to say, this kind of contrarian sort of thing. It seems obvious that gerrymandering is causing some of the polarization, and it's hard to figure out just how much at the margin. And on the other hand, I think there's a lot to be said for taking the districting process out of the hands of state legislatures and putting them into nonpartisan commissions or nonpartisan bodies. And I think that is an institutional basis for depolarization that really should be explored. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, Linda, because I think it's an extraordinarily promising avenue that would lead to depolarization.
Let me just add on the gerrymandering issue that in addition to the Senate comparison that Rick mentions, part of the debate in political science has been that, well, given the geographic distribution of voters now, even if you did compact contiguous districts that conform to existing town and county, other sorts of sort of natural lines, you would still have districts that were pretty polarized one way or another. So there's no doubt that gerrymandering is part of the picture, but how much it is really hard to settle. Let me ask on behalf of the audience a further and a provocative question, but it is appropriate, I think, at a time in which many states, including this one, are considering new efforts to make sure that those who vote really are entitled to vote. This question is, did Madison make a mistake in failing to foresee that the electorate would not be limited to, quote, reasonable men, but that we would have universal suffrage? Let me modify this to say is, should we be concerned about the structure of voting qualifications in the United States today? Anyone want to take a stab at it?
You mean the whole voter ID controversy?
That was my reference, yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll just put it on the table and let's all assume that this whole voter ID thing is not actually aimed at making sure that everybody who votes is qualified to vote. It's targeted to make sure that people that we don't want to vote are somehow deterred from voting. So that's not a neutral, good government kind of effort either in Pennsylvania or anyplace else. I'll just say that.
But is the question, was universal suffrage a mistake? Is that the question?
It appears to be.
That's a deep and old argument in democratic theory, and there's one view which is that we ought to let people who know their way around politics run politics, and the other view is that if you have universal suffrage, you get a lot more common sense built into politics, and ordinary people have a stake in the system, and it's actually a guarantee of continuity and stability. If you don't have universal suffrage, then you build in alienation, and that's bad for a republic. So I'm a big fan of universal suffrage.
When you talk about the Constitution, you have to talk about the amendments to the Constitution, and all of the amendments, many of the amendments that have come on, have been to expand suffrage, and that's been one generation after another has seen fit to make sure that African Americans were able to vote, and that women were able to vote, and that 18-year-olds were able to vote. In fact, the only amendment that limits your voting rights was the amendment that said you can only vote for a president twice, and that was to keep Franklin Roosevelt from running again, even though he had died before that amendment was adopted. But the fact that he ran 4 times was seen as something that should not be repeated. And that's made every president who's reelected a lame duck for his second term. But every other amendment that's been added to the Constitution has been to expand it. And that's one of the great parts about the Constitution, was that they knew that they hadn't solved all the problems, and they did provide for provisions for amending it. They made it very difficult to amend the Constitution. And I always like to point out that there have been 11,000 amendments proposed, but only, I think, 35 were passed by Congress, only 27 were approved by the states. In 200 years, that's a remarkably small change, but a very large percentage of that has been for expanding suffrage.
So the Constitution is difficult to amend. We've discussed how constitutional structures pose barriers to rapid governance on many issues. You have to build broad agreement, and how that might, in a time of polarization, make it difficult for government to act. building coalitions for change is influenced by the fact that it is part of our constitutional development that, hard as it is to amend the Constitution, we've chosen repeatedly to make the system more democratic than it was before. But the next question relates to arguments about how you achieve change, building broad coalitions of an expanded American people to make this constitutional system work. It asks, don't the highly productive Congresses that we've heard of, such as under FDR, under LBJ, don't they only appear after what the questioner calls wave elections? Could it be that the problem is not so much with the structure of the constitutional system, but that we're at a point where there somehow needs to be built a broader coalition that can produce a wave election, getting enough people in the different branches of government that we can move forward? Is that the core problem? And if so, what are our prospects for dealing with it?
Well, they're right about the wave elections. Larry O'Brien was the White House liaison with Congress in Johnson, and he said on election night, 1964, Medicare effectively was passed because they added 40 extra seats in the House of Representatives, and Johnson had a very compliant Congress at that point. But you should also remember that he got a lot of votes from Republicans at that time, and so did FDR actually. And the two parties have also changed very dramatically. And the years since I've been working at the Congress, since 1976, the two political parties are completely different than they were. When I first came to work there, we had Republicans who were more liberal than most of the Democrats, Jacob Javits being one of them. And we had Democrats who were more conservative than most of the Republicans, Jim Eastland being a good character. Every vote was a bipartisan vote because it was the conservatives in both parties voting against the liberals in both parties, and each side trying to get the moderates to come together. Whenever the majority leader, Mike Mansfield, filed the cloture motion, the minority leader, Hugh Scott, was his co-sponsor on that. And so a lot of these bills, even though they were waves, it wasn't just one party doing it. What's happened in the last 30 years is that both parties have gotten very cohesive. They're very much more like parliamentary parties now. And they think alike. And that's not really bad that everybody in one party thinks alike and everybody in the other party thinks alike but very differently. It just makes it very hard under the current structure to be able to pull together a coalition to do something. There was a time, actually, back in the 1950s and early 1960s, that political scientists were complaining that the two parties were divided. We had four parties in Congress.
You don't need to go into that too much.
And what we needed to do is have this cohesiveness and beware of what you ask for because you might actually get it.
Careful what you wish for is the story for the political science profession. We argued for ideologically unified parties, and now we have them. And
now we're worried.
Now we're worried. So. Any other thoughts on this wave election question? Does the answer really lie outside the halls of government in the broader society and political processes?
Well, Don's comment about the two parliamentary parties, of course, raises the question of, do we have that being the political reality, do we have the right structure? Because, of course, most countries that have parliamentary parties have a parliamentary system. So I just put that out there.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think people are in legal academia. There's Stanford Levinson at the University of Texas Law School inspired an article by Jeffrey Toobin in the New Yorker, and there's going to be a discussion here about called Our Broken Constitution. And the idea is that we've got parliamentary parties matched to a separation of power system, and they don't work well. And
just to be sure everyone understands, of course, in a parliamentary system, if you win the election, you get to appoint all the ministers in the government, so you cannot have the division between the executive branch and the legislative branch in party control that we often have with our separation of powers system.
Right, and so we get divided government, and there's an issue. Can you have government divided and get things done? And it's the only way to break that stalemate or logjam is to have these wave elections. And there is a finding that actually that there's an awful lot of continuous lawmaking, and that it doesn't really, there are surges, but those surges are more the kinds of things that you saw on the wall at the LBJ library. There are periods when there is a kind of public mood of let's get things done, and everyone's on the same page, and yes, election results seem to suggest that there is something there, but think about the fact that a lot of what happened during the Johnson administration was carried on by Nixon, and that the mood, let's regulate, let's fix society, let's deal with poverty, let's, I mean, Nixon proposed actually a guaranteed family income, and which is an extraordinary idea. Democrats were so suspicious, they said it can't be true. But it was part of the public mood that we can use government to solve problems. And so that these moods come and go over the course of our history, and I don't think that that government structure often is really the source of blockage. Given these public moods, we can get things done. Now, of course, the issue is, will that mood come again? Given that we've got two camps that are very, very different from each other, and have a lot of trouble talking to each other.
Well, let me ask one last question for you all to comment on that indicates widespread concern about what's gone wrong with American government, and it is the question of how lobbyists, and I'll add special advocacy groups, special interest groups, have they become too influential? Are they dominating Congress? Are they setting the agenda of the court? Are they influencing elections and parties in ways that don't add up to the general interest?
Well, lobbyists are a big part of life in Capitol Hill. A lot of former members go off from Congress to lobby. A lot of former staff go off to lobby. I did an oral history once with George Smathers, who'd been a senator from Florida, and then went on to become a very successful lobbyist. I said, what was it like? He said, oh, it was wonderful. He said, when all my former colleagues would always keep their doors open to me. I could always get in to see them. But when I approached them, they all had their hand out. And he said, it cost me a lot more initially to be a lobbyist than I thought, because he was paying for campaign financial contributions. And in fact, the matter is that is the other flip side of this issue of lobbying, is this demand to raise enormous amounts of money, largely because the Supreme Court's taken the lid off of it, and members of Congress now spend a great deal of time, and it's created confusion as to why people are doing things, and the perception often is that they're doing it because of the campaign finances that the lobbyists are involved with. Money talks, and those with more money talk louder, and that's a fact of political life.
And I think part of the problem is the invisible lobbying. So, if the American Beverage Council, or I don't know the name of it, is lobbying on behalf of their industrial interests, that's pretty obvious. But it's the sort of dark side of lobbying and campaign finance, and these organizations with these mysterious names, and you can't track it back through the 527s and all that stuff, that I think is pretty pernicious.
Well, there are two issues. I mean, one is campaign finance and the revolution in campaign finance, and we're still sort of trying to figure out the fallout from that. And the other is the lobbying, and that's a First Amendment protected activity as well. And a lot of lobbying involves presenting facts in a slanted way. It's not people walking around with bundles of cash. It's more, let me tell you my side of the story. And the interesting thing is that every member of Congress and every staff member has heard every side. So they're never hearing anything new that they already haven't heard. So I always wonder whether lobbying really makes that much of a difference. I think the one finding that we know, which is consistent with the George Smathers idea, is that former staffers and former members of Congress have a much easier time of making contact and getting somebody to sit down and listen to them. But every side has already been discussed and on any issue. And that's why political scientists regularly find that lobbying makes no difference to roll call outcomes. We can't have polarized parties running things and also have lobbyists running things, right? Because polarized parties means that the politicians have their own very strong policy ideas. And if a lobbyist comes from another side of the of the political division and tries to get them to look at it, they're not going to pay any attention to that. It doesn't matter if they spent 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours with that person. So very ideological politicians means that lobbyists are essentially talking to people who have already had their minds made up. They can talk all they want. I often wonder just how much of a big deal the lobbying industry actually is.
You had mentioned information, and they do provide information. I did an oral history with Ted Kaufman, who was a senator from Delaware, asking what was the best thing about having been a staff member for many years. That was the best thing about being a senator. He said, you could get any information you wanted. You could pick up the phone and make a call, and your calls were always returned, and you always got that information. And the government needs great amounts of information. I sometimes think, I agree with you, that some members just aren't listening, and that's one of the big problems. But if they want to hear, they've got any kind of information at their fingertips.
Yeah.
The government needs information, so do citizens. Many of you will know the famous story after the Constitution was adopted. Ben Franklin was asked, what kind of system was this? Was it a system of self-government? And he said, it's a republic, if you can keep it. I think the discussion shows that there are real challenges to keeping our constitutional republic going, but it can only operate successfully if citizens get informed, engage the issues, have discussions, and that's why I want to close by thanking all of you for coming out and participating, as well as thanking the panelists.
Thank you.